Windows on ARM is complete trash. Okay, I'm kidding. Windows on ARM is actually pretty much, it's fine in a lot of respects. I did a video about this laptop, which is a Microsoft Surface laptop, about 2 weeks ago or so, and it is running a Qualcomm Snapdragon processor. That's an ARM processor. And Windows on ARM experience on this has been very good. However, there were some people in the comments who very politely pointed out that there are certain things you can't do on this laptop or which don't work as well as it should. So, in the interest of fairness and keeping, you informed, I wanted to make a quick video going over 5 reasons you actually should avoid Windows on ARM. And the first reason we're going to talk about is gaming. Now, this is the most obvious reason of all because most games simply do not support Windows on ARM. With the announcement that Apple is going to go all Apple Silicon with its future macOS releases, Valve has announced a version of Steam that's going to be made specifically for their ARM processors, that is, the Apple Silicon ARM processors, but it's unclear whether that is going to translate to a Windows version. I kind of suspect it will eventually, but when that will happen is unclear. And overall, there's not any of the digital storefronts right now that have great Windows on ARM support. In fact, something that's really weird is that even the Microsoft Store and Xbox Live, you might think that Microsoft would put some effort onto Windows on ARM support for the Xbox games, right? Xbox Live games that they would run natively on Windows on ARM. But, that's not really the case, actually. There's very, very, very few games on the Windows Store that run natively on Windows on ARM. And unfortunately, the other reality here is that emulating games is pretty difficult. Games are very complex pieces of software, and so the emulation layer that is on these laptops oftentimes has trouble, and even sometimes games that are not really that graphically demanding will not run well through emulation. I, for example, was playing Diablo 2 Resurrected, which is not like a hugely graphically demanding game, but I was lucky to get 60 to 70 FPS on medium to low settings on this laptop, which is a lot worse performance than I would receive if I was running on an AMD Ryzen laptop with, like, say, a Radeon 880M, or even the Intel Arc graphics. The new Intel Arc graphics run that game way, way better. So if you want the game, you should really avoid Windows on ARM for now. Another example of things that might prevent you from buying a Windows on ARM laptop right now is support for certain peripherals that you already own. Like, here's a great example, printers. I actually didn't even think about this when I was making my video about the Surface laptop, which again, I really like. But, one thing this laptop can't do, I discovered, is print on my old Canon, I think it's an MF3010 printer, laser printer, black and white. I think I've had it for like 10 years, and it's a great printer, which is why I keep it. None of that like subscription nonsense that you find with some of the new printers. However, there is no driver for Windows on ARM for that printer, which is not a big surprise because it's a very old printer, and it's not getting any driver updates anymore. So I can't print from this laptop. Now, that's not really a problem for me because I have a desktop too, and that is usually what's connected to my printer. So that's why I didn't really think about it. But, if you just want to buy one laptop and have that for everything, which I think is the case for most people, then you're going to run into problems like that. Another really common area this can be an issue is with like certain hubs and docks. Some of them actually require driver support. Well, you are quite likely to find that there is not a driver. And a lot of times this just comes down to the fact that these are oftentimes put out by smaller companies that don't have the opportunity to put out drivers for every, new configuration that comes out. And so Windows on ARM falls by the wayside. On a similar sort of, vein, you're going to also find problems with certain applications that are not perhaps the most mainstream applications, but which might be really, really important to you, that you absolutely need to have work. A great example of this is AutoCAD. A lot of people use AutoCAD, and I was looking at the support for that, and they still do not have any Windows on ARM support listed, and I couldn't find any details of any plans to support Windows on ARM. And AutoCAD is a pretty complicated program, so your chances of getting that to work without, through emulation, without the official native Windows on ARM support, I would say are not going to be super great. I was also surprised to find that it looks like Adobe Premiere Pro, as of right now, still does not have native Windows on ARM support. I actually thought it did because some other Adobe programs do have Windows on ARM support. I would say, I think the bulk of them do at this point, but Premiere Pro, it looks like it isn't working yet. So you're in that Adobe workflow, and I do think a majority of people still are. You're going to have problems trying to use a Windows on ARM system. It just isn't going to perform as well as you might expect. Now, in addition to that, you should also think about older applications and not whether or not they will run, because oftentimes they do. I'm talking about applications that might be 10 years old and they're not going to get an update. A lot of times they will run fine through the emulation because the emulation is pretty compatible and there is so much performance on this laptop. It's a really good performer. Despite that performance, you're still going to potentially run into issues with battery life and just like little hesitation or hitching here and there if things are running under emulation. And there are, of course, a lot of concerns about that with Windows. Whereas in the Apple ecosystem, they kind of tell you to update to support the latest stuff or just, prepare to get booted off the App Store or just faded out of existence. With Windows, they do want to try and provide a lot of support for older software. And there's a lot of people who are on older software that need that for this or that work need, or they just particularly like something and they want to stick with it. When you're running an app that is running under emulation, it oftentimes uses more processor and battery life than you would expect. So there's enough performance here that you don't really notice a performance issue. But because you are actually using a bit more CPU cycles than you would otherwise, you do end up seeing battery life, which doesn't live up to those extreme figures of up to 16, 18, 20 hours that you potentially can get with this laptop if you're only running native Windows on ARM apps. And then the final thing to keep in mind is support for development tools. So Microsoft has a huge development ecosystem. They love to support developers as much as possible. It's very key for them. I mean, Microsoft at the end of the day is primarily an enterprise company, really, not a consumer company.
Developers, 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 developers. Developers, 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 developers. Yes!
And so for them, the developers that they're trying to cater to are actually more important than like Windows end users. I would say, I think it's very fair to say that developers are more important to Microsoft than, your average person who buys a Windows laptop. And for that reason, there is a lot of really good support for native Microsoft tools like VS Code on this Surface laptop and on the Qualcomm Snapdragon X chips more generally. They run really beautifully. However, where you start to run into problems is as you get deeper and deeper into your development journey and you start to rely on more and more niche tools, or you start to install various dependencies very rapidly, then you can start to run into things that have not been designed for Windows on ARM, that haven't made that leap quite yet. Also, another issue is the simple fact that Windows on ARM is still a very small portion of the market, right? Like, I think I've seen it at like 1% of the market right now. So if you are a developer developing for Windows, do you want to develop for 1% of the market? Probably not. So although you can very likely develop an application on this laptop, when it comes to testing and verifying that application, you probably are going to need an x86 system, somewhere in your workflow in order to test that your app is actually going to work correctly. I mean, it should, but you want to make sure that's actually going to be the case. Now, this again, it depends on how deep you're going in the weeds here, because I've done some programming on this laptop for a variety of hobbyist projects. I did a Pico 8 game. I developed a web app for tabletop role-playing, and I also did some Python programming for a Raspberry Pi weather station. All that is fairly simple stuff, and as you might expect, it all worked beautifully on the Windows on ARM system. There was no compatibility issues whatsoever. I mean, none. No crashes, nothing I had to reinstall. No performance issues at any point in any of those particular apps. But I mean, they're hobbyist apps. They're not big things. They're not relying on a lot of different dependencies. They wouldn't be using a lot of performance in any case. So you really have to judge for yourself, what are you doing? If you just are doing some hobbyist programming, Windows on ARM is probably fine. Or, if you have a very specific workflow that is not very demanding. I mean, like a lot of web app development workflows are not necessarily going to be all that demanding. And since it's going to go on the web, you may not be so worried about how it runs on ARM or x86, since it's going to be running on the web browser one way or another. But of course, on the other hand, there's programmers working on things that I can't even fathom that are spinning up virtual machines or, compiling huge projects or trying to do specific performance optimizations to make sure that their app works as well as possible. So in those sort of situations, going with Windows on ARM is likely to be a problem. And ultimately what this circles around on is that there's kind of a interesting contradiction here with Windows on ARM right now, where on the one hand, I think Windows on ARM is in many ways great. This laptop, as I said in my long-term review of it, which I'll link in the description, has been incredibly stable, fast, and generally had excellent battery life. I've really enjoyed my time with this laptop. I've had very few problems with Windows on ARM. Really, my personal issues that I've run into have been entirely about gaming, which I do like to occasionally do on a laptop, and which has not been good on this. However, at the same time, as you can see from these examples I have given, there are a lot of cases where Windows on ARM is not going to work for you. And it's not because Windows on ARM is bad, it's just that it's not really developed enough to support that use case or this use case, or maybe it's because there's a application or a peripheral that relies on drivers that are never going to get a Windows on ARM update. That is the painful part of making the transition from one instruction set to another. Now, Windows is, I think, a lot further along this journey than it was even a few years ago, at any point prior to 2024. But as I talk about these different examples, you can see how you can imagine a Venn diagram with yourself. Are you going to intersect with that Venn diagram? And as these little bubbles of edge cases sort of come together, it's more and more likely you're going to find yourself in that camp where Windows on ARM is maybe not the greatest option for you. So again, I don't want to ring a huge alarm bell about Windows on ARM because I do think it's generally good, but I wanted you to be aware of this so that if you are thinking about buying Windows on ARM, you can decide, do I fit in any of these use cases or not? If you do, then maybe do avoid Windows on ARM for now. But if you are not hearing anything here that would give you pause, then go for it. And I'll be interested to see, what Qualcomm says later this year. I expect they'll probably have some new announcements. So perhaps that will also come with some announcements related to better compatibility. Particularly, I would like to see them do more with the GPU emulation and GPU drivers. Anyway, let me know what you're thinking about Windows on ARM right now. Have you tried to buy a Windows on ARM laptop and then decided not to for some reason? Did you make the leap and actually end up having a good experience? Let me know in the comments what you're thinking. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.